Games are typically broken down into 5 main categories: gameplay, graphics, story, replayability, and soundtrack, or some combination of these and whatever the publication decides to throw in. But in almost every case, the soundtrack is considered when considering the game's overall impact. You can have games that are okay but have a great soundtrack. And you can have games that are pretty good, but what the hell happened in the studio? Now, as a longtime music producer myself, I like to think that I've got an ear for these kinds of things, and that's why I put together a list of the best and worst soundtracks of 2016. Not top 5 or top whatever, just categorically soundtracks that I feel should be recognized this year. Starting with the longest category name we have today, the soundtrack that could easily be a score for a traditional big budget movie. Space Run Galaxy's soundtrack as a whole could very easily be swapped out with just about any major space opera film that's come out in the past 30 years. I'm not saying that Leon Shelby, the composer of this soundtrack, has bested the works of John Williams, but he's definitely on the right track. And this isn't a one-note soundtrack. There is a massive amount of dynamics between some of the quieter, more still pieces, all the way up to the more driving and iconic pieces that contain the recurring theme of the soundtrack. Now, recurring theme, this is something that not a lot of soundtracks do that much anymore, especially in games. In games, a lot of times you have essentially a collection of different songs that all would fit in the same, it sound like they belong on the same album, but they don't necessarily repeat some of the same themes in different ways. And that's something that is usually typical on most movie soundtracks because they want to drive home that theme. They want you to think of this melody whenever you think of that movie. Here are a few examples of different pieces within this soundtrack that maintain the same theme but deliver it in a completely different way. Everyone's got a favorite soundtrack or two that they're like, oh man, I'd love listening to that, but I would probably not listen to it while I'm driving down the streets of Long Beach with the top down. It's just something that I wouldn't do. It doesn't quite fit the mood of doing that. And that's why I want to recognize these games and their compatibility to music I like to listen to while behind the wheel. Starting with Fury. The Fury soundtrack is an excellent compilation of music from Knight, Wave Shaper, Scattle, Lorne, The Toxic Avenger, Danger, and Carpenter Brut. It's the kind of compilation that you could pick up without ever even playing the game and be completely satisfied with it. Now, the game itself, Fury, is a heavily stylized boss rush hack and slash, and the soundtrack has been tuned in such a way to give a lot of dynamic to the way the game plays. It's obviously a boss rush, there's a lot of stuff going on, a lot of action and such, but the action intensifies as you move on to the later phases of each boss fight. Therefore, the music itself also pitches itself in order to reflect the action that's occurring on the screen at that moment. If you'd like to know more about Fury the game, you could check out Mandy for Breakfast here. But for now, let's focus on the compilation because it is probably the absolute best compilation of synthwave music to come out in the past year and a half, maybe even more. Now, if you're interested in this style of music, it's called synthwave, and it is essentially a modern take on new wave music where everything kind of hits a little bit harder, there's a lot more compression, it's very danceable as you can hear, and usually very edgy and sometimes very dark. We all know that the 80s is coming back in various different forms all over the place with Kung Fury and with Vaporwave. We're seeing it everywhere, so it's no surprise that we see a genre like this kind of emerge and become relatively popular, especially within games and such. But hands down, the Fury soundtrack is the best collection of songs to listen to in your car, with the windows down, driving down Hollywood Boulevard at night, maybe with a couple honeys, or by yourself, whatever. Now, since this is my show and I make all the rules, I'm going to go ahead and mention a game that was released in 2015 because it is absolutely worth an honorable mention, if you will. It's called Rockets, Rockets, Rockets. It is a party game for up to 4 players. You guys run around with rockets and shoot each other, whatever. The soundtrack is so good and definitely falls in the category of soundtracks you listen to while driving on the car, the honeys and Hollywood and all that stuff. Now, a game like Rockets, Rockets, Rockets is a good game, but it doesn't quite stand up to the quality of the soundtrack itself. I think the soundtrack is phenomenal, and I think the game is just okay. But there are other games out there that are really, really bad, but have a fucking amazing soundtrack. And you already know what I'm talking about. It's No Man's Sky. haven't been this excited over that much reverb on guitars since like early Cradle of Filth or Typo Negative, or even like Injustice for All. Usually when you're adding this much reverb to something, you're trying to create the sense of space, which is funny because from an audio production perspective, using reverb actually takes up space. So what you want to do, and in this case, what 65 Days of Static are trying to achieve here, is they're trying to show that this album, this entire concept here that they've created, is essentially indicative of something that's larger than you, larger than anything you could possibly understand. And that's what the point of No Man's Sky was supposed to be. It was a universe that was larger than you could possibly understand, like a number that you couldn't even begin to understand how large the number of planets that were supposed to be available for you to explore. And that is exactly what they did. Now, I should note that while I do consider other soundtracks to be better, or at least better matched to the games that they're written for, I will say that I have actually played No Man's Sky soundtrack infinitely more than any other album this year. It is my most played album this year by a long shot, like even regular music, like non-soundtrack music. It just demolishes all of those. And it's primarily because it is so easy to listen to. There's so much dynamic to it. It's easy to listen to while going to sleep. It's easy to listen to while working. It is just overall a fantastically designed album as a whole, and it's absolutely worth a listen. Matching up a soundtrack to a game or vice versa is art, it is a skill, it is luck, it is a combination of all these things. It is a lot of work to make happen, and the goal is ultimately that somebody who has played your game can listen to a soundtrack or listen to a piece of a soundtrack and place that within the environment that you've created, or somebody that's playing the game perhaps with the sound off can still hear that soundtrack playing in their head. Now, up until this point, we've mainly discussed games that have had soundtracks that can essentially stand alone. With Rockets, No Man's Sky, like these have soundtracks that can be completely separated from their game counterparts. But now I want to focus on the games that are inseparable to their soundtrack. When you think of the game, you think of the soundtrack. When you think of the soundtrack, you think of the game. And they're completely inseparable. And that's why we have more than one in this particular category that are absolutely worth mention. Starting with there really is no question here, right? Anybody that's played Doom 2016 has to agree that these two things were meant to be. If you don't think so, you're probably just trying to be an edgy asshole, to be honest. But it really is a perfect marriage of visuals and sound. Now, I cover this pretty extensively in my BFF report coverage of Doom, but just to recap a little bit, for example, the tearing sound that Mick Gordon uses melodically within the soundtrack actually fits perfectly with the tearing sound that you would expect to hear when ripping some demon's head off. And actually, in some cases, you hear that when you're actually going in for like a close encounter kill, you get this kind of break in the music, and it just dynamically loads in another sound, which is kind of like a guitar riff. It kind of comes in and plays, and it's just like you're ripping someone's head off, and it's like, wah, and it's just playing this riff, and everything syncs so perfectly together, and it's the way it's sequenced and how smoothly it goes in and out of all of these things, it just enhances the gameplay overall. In a lot of cases with a lot of games, you could turn off the music and play some of your favorite jams in the background if you want to, but in this case, you would actually be taking away from some of the experience, some of the immersion that you have within the Doom environment. Goner's soundtrack, composed by Regular Graphics and titled Press Jump to Die, is best described as quirky, and the game itself, aesthetically, can also be described as quirky. It is a procedurally generated platformer shooter, something that we've seen a billion of, but it's highly, highly, highly stylized. I mean, you've already seen it. It is not like anything you've ever seen, and it is loads and loads of fun. And the soundtrack just, it's so fucking weird. It just fits perfectly. Now, despite the fact that the game is procedurally generated, it does have individual assigned and fixed zones. So there is a death zone, there is a shop, there is an area in between worlds where you visit your friend, and there is a World 1 and a World 1 boss. The boss is fixed, the World 1 section, main section, is procedurally generated. But each one of these areas and basically parts of the game all have their own assigned soundtrack. So they become a fixture in that line of progression. But what really grabs me about Goner's soundtrack is that each track is so different, and yet it still feels like it's cut from the same cloth. Have a listen and a look at some of the visuals matched up with their assigned soundtrack pieces. If you're a fan of Mike Paradinas, Aphex Twin, Boards of Canada, Square Pusher, etc., you're probably somebody who could listen to the soundtrack on the side. It is right up there with those guys in terms of style and just overall just weirdness, which is what we love those other producers for, is that their ability to make weird fucking music that is extremely catchy and just fun to listen to. And just like the Doom soundtrack, it fits perfectly with Goner. So you can listen to it on its own if you're a fan of that style of music, just like the Doom soundtrack, but it's also pretty safe to say that it is a perfect match of audio and visuals. If you see an explosion, you expect to hear a boom, and that is exactly what both Doom and Goner have pulled off with their respective soundtracks. Best Worst Soundtrack is probably the most important category this year, because in order to really understand and appreciate when something is good, you need to understand and appreciate what makes something bad. And listening to the worst of the worst is not a good way to get a sense of what is necessarily bad, because worst of the worst is like the zero effort, things that probably shouldn't even be considered for anything at all. Whereas the best worst are things that have maybe high production value, lots of effort, or something that goes into, or maybe just a lot of money behind whatever that product is. Think of it like a music album, right? Somebody puts out an album, it's like, wow, there's a lot of guest artists on this. There was a lot of production put into this. It's just horrendously bad, to the point to where it causes confusion in the listener, anger in the listener, perhaps murderous thoughts. These are all things that you need to feel. You're not going to get that from the worst of the worst. Worst of the worst is just kind of like why would I even make this? And you turn it off. But best of the worst should evoke new or potentially untapped emotions from the listener. Allow me to introduce to you this year's best worst soundtrack.
It's Cody Show!
That is Cody Show. I think I'm wicked. I'm still in my teens, but I've had a million kids. Because of that, I've put it back a little bit. But everybody knows I'm proper well fit. I'm the queen of the streets, and I'm proper flipping beats. Any of my honeys can tell you I'm so sweet, cause I'm gangster. I'm a prankster. You can see me anytime around Astor.
Now, if you're new to this channel, or if you're new to just this particular video, or maybe you didn't see the Indie for Breakfast where I covered this particular game in depth-ish, you're probably thinking, oh yeah, this guy just like threw a stupid game at the end to kind of wrap it up in a funny way. He's trying to be funny. No. That is completely wrong. This game absolutely deserves this award. The soundtrack alone is a perfect reflection of the game. It's 24 tracks. Probably like 18 of them are fully scripted and voiced with singing and rapping and harmonization, if you want to call it that. There are full instrumentals behind them. It's a full fucking album of this. Each one is different. The titles, the subject matter ranges from obviously dungeon themes, respect, that time I had sex with the mermaid. There's so much happening in just the soundtrack. When you look at it and you go through and you just randomly click through each one. Let's do that real quick.
I want to come into your forest and see your lady garden. Show it to me, we did the nasty. That time I had sex with a mermaid.
A request with a modest proposal.
Being sleazy, you've got to stimulate and tease. You've died, you want to lose your anything.
Name, I've been on top and I'll be
Hey bad bitches, you're a basic bitch. Hips have gone, but they're still hip.
Going hard till the end.
Rap, it'll never be the same.
Oh, digital sex.
You're the only one who
Popping a Christmas baby, have I?
Do you see what I'm talking about? And I'm telling you, the game is just bad enough, or just good enough. I don't know. I don't actually know. Like it's you're playing it, and it's got an RPG sense. There's like progression, and there's story, and there's tons of VO, like tons and tons of VO, and you just don't know where it stops. And I haven't finished the game. I don't intend to, but just seeing the soundtrack and how much was put into this, how much just effort was put into the soundtrack, you can feel that. I don't know. It's a joke. I don't know what it was. But hopefully fuck you. I don't know if you agree or not. This definitely is the best worst soundtrack of 2016. Fuck. That has been the best and worst soundtracks of 2016. Thank you so much for your support. And if you're supporting me on Patreon, thank you again. You make this entire thing possible. Would not even be here doing this if it wasn't for you folks. My name is Mike B, aka Phony, and I'll see you guys next year.
We must part here, my dear beauty, but we shall meet again.